Greetings and welcome to Campus Conversations. I'm Dan Moguloff from the university's Office of Communications and Public Affairs. And today I'm honored to welcome Chancellor Carol Christ for this special end of semester edition. We're going to be talking about the usual wide array of interesting issues and areas of concern and challenges and opportunities, and also about where we've been and where we're headed. And as always, we welcome and need your questions along the way. And if you'd like to pose a question for the Chancellor, just post it to our Facebook live streaming site, and we'll do our very best to respond. Let's get started. Carol, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Dan.
So why don't we just share a little bit about what you're thinking, as you look back on the semester that's passed and the one that's coming our way after the winter break, what's on your mind these days?
Well, it's been such an unusual semester, a strange semester in many ways. First of all, there was the incredible joy of coming back together in person. I think the beginning of the fall semester the campus felt more alive, more populated than any semester since the beginning of the pandemic. And I kept feeling so much joy on the part of students, particularly, but also faculty and staff, of just being together again. So that was really just wonderful. And then, of course, we had the incredible highlight of this year, just a few weeks ago, of hitting the $6 billion mark in our campaign some 14 months early, ahead of schedule. So that's really exciting. Extraordinary generosity on the part of our friends and donors. And I'm so excited for all the ways in which that campaign strengthens the campus, enriches the campus. But then, of course, now we're all in the middle of the strikes, and the multiple strikes, and that is really challenging for our undergraduates. It's made the end of the semester, which is a very tense time for any student as you come to terms with final assignments, final papers, final exams. Really feeling like the absence of the GSIs in particular, they're so important a part of their instruction, and challenging also for the faculty, many of whom are doing heroic things to try to offer as much of the instruction that the students have the right to expect as they possibly can do. So it's a challenging time right now. I want to thank the students and the faculty for all of the efforts they're putting in a period of challenge for them.
Thanks for those opening thoughts. I'm like to drill down on each of those three things you mentioned: the pandemic, the campaign, and the strike. And just starting with the pandemic, it's interesting. I had to check through my email archives this week, looking for an old email, and I saw I was writing to somebody in April of 2020. Yeah, in a few weeks we'll be back to normal. And I was like, what the heck was I thinking? I'm wondering, just as we step back a little bit, whether you think the impact of the pandemics have passed as far as the university is concerned, whether you're starting to see the contours of a new normal emerge, or whether it's still in flux. How are you thinking about the institution and the pandemic these days?
Well, I think it's certainly the last two of what you said. I don't think the pandemic will ever be in the rearview mirror. First of all, COVID-19 is going to be an endemic disease. We just will have to learn to live with it. And whenever you have a historic pandemic, if it's, whether it's the Black Death or the influenza epidemic at the end of the First World War, or this pandemic, it changes the consciousness of that historical period. And I feel there's so much evidence for the way in which it's changed our consciousness. I just recently read a wonderful book by Elizabeth Stroud called Lucy by the Sea, which is about the experience of a woman who had lived in New York, goes up to Maine, with her ex-husband during the early days of the pandemic and lives there for the pandemic. And it brought me back to how the pandemic felt in those early months, the sense of fear, the sense of just not knowing what this was, the sense of vulnerability. I think we still haven't come to terms with the psychological impact of the pandemic. All of our institutions, all of our intimate relationships, all of our less intimate but friendly relationships have been changed by the experience of the pandemic. And so we have so much repair work to be done, to do, and so much building community to do. And I think that the pandemic has had an impact on people that often we don't even realize as we start to try to rebuild community. It won't be the same as before, in part because of the experience that we've been through. It creates the sense of fragility that this could happen again. And we also have become, to look on a different side of this, very much more adept at remote ways of doing things. If we had been doing this before the pandemic, we would be in person in an auditorium. And now this has become part of our toolbox. We use virtual ways of having meetings at a distance, making presentations. Faculty have discovered digital tools that they're not going to discard because the pandemic is less present as constant in our lives than it was before. So things are changed. Things are changed both because of the trauma that I don't think we've yet finished processing, and things have changed as a result of the ways in which digital tools have become even more a part of how we conduct many kinds of business.
So but it almost sounds like there may be two opposing forces, which is, in the wake of the pandemic, people, rebuilding community, coming together, but still the persistence and the persistent existence and utilization of virtual tools that sort of keep us apart. How do you see that balance in terms of the university?
Oh my goodness, that's such a hard question. I really believe in the university as an in-person community, but I know that people's working habits have changed. Many people find great convenience in working remotely. I notice you're probably not in a university office right now. I am, obviously. But so it's really changed people's sense of how they do work and where they do work. And I think it's been an extender of contact. I'm in a number of, international university presidents groups. They don't meet in person. They meet on the screen. And it's actually, with the exception of the ungodly times in which we have to meet to accommodate everybody's time zone, it's actually better. I love not getting on a plane and, going sleepless for 18 hours and landing someplace and being there for 2 days and coming back again. That's great. So I just think it's a very complex, and in historical terms, it's a pretty intense and change over a relatively short period of time when you think about historical change.
Yeah, that's a good point. It feels so long and it feels so short at the same time. It's been sort of a time warpage. I wanted to ask you about the campaign before I do, just for people who've joined us late. We're having our end of semester conversation with Chancellor Carol Christ. We welcome your questions as always. They can be posted to our Facebook Live streaming site. So the campaign, 14 months early, $6 billion, that seems like a good chunk of change. Were you surprised?
Very surprised. I mean, it's surprised in two ways. First of all, when we decided on the $6 billion goal, we thought it was really a stretch goal. We thought it was going to be hard to make. It was, almost twice as much as the university had ever raised before in a campaign. So we thought it was going to be a challenge. And then we met the goal 14 months early. The other huge surprise is I thought when the pandemic struck, we had the public kickoff of the campaign 10 days before we went remote with the pandemic. And when that happened, I thought, oh, this is going to be the end of the campaign. People are going to be so reluctant to give. What really surprised me is the pandemic seemed to increase people's philanthropy. And there are lots of reasons for that. I've given it a lot of thought. I mean, in part, there was an enormous wealth created for certain segments of society during the campaign.
Right.
But I think people also felt their mortality more than they may have felt at another time. And we had a lot of conversations about legacy gifts. And I was so surprised at how easily fundraising could adapt to a digital medium. So I had lots of gift conversations about large gifts with donors on Zoom. I would never have thought that would have been possible. So I think it's a combination of really three things: the wealth that was created, particularly in some very rich segments of society. Secondly, people's increased generosity at a time when they were conscious of their own mortality and conscious of the suffering of others. And then I think that there was an increased sense of the importance of universities. The universities were so important in doing the research in kind of record warp speed in developing vaccines for the pandemic, developing cures for COVID-19, so the epidemiological research. So all of that, I think, contributed to the increase in philanthropy that we saw in our hitting our goal early.
It's so interesting. So the $6 billion, it is a lot of money. How to get our arms around what that will mean for the university? What difference will that make? What becomes possible as a result of pretty stunning success?
Well, one of a kind of common misconception is that here, the chancellor's just sitting up here in her office with $6 billion kind of tucked in her desk. People give to specific purposes. There are almost no gifts that are general discretionary money for the university. Things that have really moved donors during this campaign have been scholarships for undergraduate students. We had a $400 million goal. We hit it early. So that was really exciting. The Basic Needs Center was very successful in its fundraising. We saw a huge increase in gifts to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that area did extremely well. We've had more challenges raising money for our building projects. I sometimes wonder if, was that a consequence also of people being mostly remote? And you can't build half a building. So if you don't meet your goal for undergraduate scholarships, you still use all the money that you've raised. But if you don't hit your goal for a building, you're kind of stuck. Right. So buildings have been more challenging. We've also been raising money for graduate fellowships that we knew would be a challenging area, but we're doing very well with graduate fellowships. And we're trying to raise money for faculty positions. Again, we've set a very ambitious goal. We're about a third of the way there. So in these last 14 months, we're not doing a victory lap. What we're doing is doubling down on the areas that we have been, we still have ways to go in reaching our goals. So this year, we've been particularly emphasizing graduate fellowships because those are so important.
Yeah, how interesting. We're going to talk about buildings and infrastructure in just a bit. I should also let people know that you're suffering from a bad cold today. So I'm glad to see you're hydrating, and I'm glad you made it all the same to join us today. Regarding the strike, what can you say? Am I correct in thinking that there are some limits that you're limited in terms of what you're allowed to publicly say by law, given that we're in the middle of negotiations?
That's absolutely right. The negotiations are conducted by a bargaining team that's at the office of the president. I cannot opine on the strike. So I can say very little about the strike.
Yeah. Can you talk at all about what your sense is about where things stand right now? Or are we fairly stalemated? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or just wait and see?
I think it's just wait and see. I feel thrilled that we've settled two of the contracts and they're now being voted on for ratification, the postdocs and the professional researchers. The negotiators have been doing just incredible marathon sessions, but they still haven't reached agreement.
Yeah. And what's your level of confidence or satisfaction with whatever mitigation steps we're taking in terms of the impact, end of semester, finals, and all the rest of that?
Well, the faculty are working as hard as they can. I've talked with a number of faculty about what they've been doing in their classes. For example, Alex Filipenko does a huge astronomy, very popular astronomy class. And he's changed his final to a multiple choice final that can be machine graded. He's changed the requirements for his last assignments. I talked to another faculty member in economics where the sections do very different work from the lectures. The sections work on problem sets. And so what he does is does one section, obviously remotely, for all his 11 sections where the undergraduates can see him work through the problems in a way that his GSIs would. So there are lots of different adaptations that faculty have made. It's still not the same. Graduate students are our essential partners in the pedagogical enterprise for our undergraduates. And so, yes, their education in this last part of the semester has been harmed, but we're doing the best that we can. We're trying to create more latitude and deadlines for grade submission, and that most of the stuff about grading is in the control of the Senate, and I know they're working very hard on that.
Got it. And thanks for just filling in that gap about the limitations that are imposed upon you in terms of not being able to opine, which I'm sure is frustrating but understandable given the negotiations that are ongoing. Something else that made news this week was the fact that we have a new police chief coming.
Oh, yes.
Starting February 1st, Yogananda Pittman, who had been the interim chief of the Capitol Police, another force that has attracted a certain degree of attention. I'm just wondering, I know we had a lot of highly qualified candidates. What about her stood out for you?
Oh, well, first of all, her record. She is the first Black woman to have held any number of different positions. And her record very specifically in heading the Capitol Police at a point she took over shortly after the January 6th riots. And she was so impressive. In fact, she was just, I believe, today given a congressional medal
Wow.
for work in the aftermath of the January 6th riots. But what also impressed me is just talking with her. She's just an amazing person, and I thought she would have the ability to really connect with our community in a way that will bring us even further down the road of better public safety for the campus.
Yeah, fantastic. And so I guess she's starting February 1st, and that'll be something to look forward to. I want to go now back to something we touched on. You touched on briefly. We were talking about the campaign that was buildings and just the infrastructure issue. Why is that the center of so many? I have so many conversations that I've been aware of lately that are happening on campus and among leadership and among staff and faculty around infrastructure. What's going on? Why is it become an ascendant issue for the campus recently?
Well, it used to be the case that every 2 years, the voters would pass, or almost always pass, a general obligation bond, which was applied both to capital construction, but also to deferred maintenance. That stopped in 2006. Jerry Brown had a different philosophy about how capital construction should be financed. And what that's meant is that all the campuses have been very, very short of deferred maintenance funding. And that means a huge amount on the Berkeley campus. We're the oldest campus. And we also live in a seismically active zone. There are lots of our buildings that need seismic retrofitting. So we have an $8.6 billion combination of need for seismic retrofit and deferred maintenance. And this has gotten to be just a critical issue. There isn't any retention case for faculty that I've worked on in the last 6 to 9 months that didn't have at its center the condition of our physical facilities.
Wow.
We had a review committee come in for the Department of Chemistry. And I was told, I wasn't at the final summary meeting, but I was told their faces were ashen when they talked about the state of some of the labs in chemistry. I sometimes used to joke with Doug Clark, the Dean of Chemistry, about he gives a tour of chemistry labs, the ones in the worst condition. I call it the Dr. Frankenstein's tour of our chemistry, but it's really a problem. We got a report from the Chancellor's Advisory Committee in the Life Sciences, which spends 2/3 of its length detailing the problems with deferred maintenance that are interfering with research. So I decided we absolutely have to, it's one thing we could do is wail about how the state isn't funding deferred maintenance. And I could do that. I could wail for you if you wanted me to.
Right.
But I thought what we had to do is look at the income streams that we control and try to figure out how we can create a dedicated income stream for deferred maintenance. It's not going to be equal to the need. The need is huge, but at least we can start chipping away at the problem. Excuse me.
Yeah, please. You okay?
Mm-hmm.
Take a break. While we're breaking here,
Oh,
just remind everybody, we're joined by Chancellor Carol Christ for our end of semester conversation, talking about a wide range of campus issues, and your questions, as always, are welcome. They can be posted to our Facebook Live site, streaming site. Let's stick with infrastructure for a bit, but there is a lot of work going on. I mean, can you run down? We've got Gateway, Anchor House, grad student housing. Give us a little rundown of what's happening in infrastructure.
Well, I'm thrilled with Anchor House. That's our new residence hall for transfer students. If you drive down Oxford, it's between Berkeley Way and University Avenue, between Oxford and Shattuck. It goes up every day. I'm thrilled to see its progress. And this is the largest philanthropic gift that the campus has ever received. And the donor, it is a gift that's giving twice, because the donor is insisting that the money that we save by there not being any long-term debt on the building be used for financial aid for our neediest students. So that's, excuse me for a minute.
Yeah, take a break. If we have, don't hesitate to let me know if we need to cut this short today. Okay.
I will.
Okay.
And then the Gateway, of course, is our new home for what will be a new college, the College of Computing, Data Science, and Society, on the former site of Tolman Hall. And that's a big hole in the ground right now, but it gets to be a bigger and bigger hole every day, which is great. And we are about to break ground in the spring on a set of new graduate student apartments that are that'll be down at University Village in Albany. That'll be about 770 apartments, I think. So that's really a project that's exciting, not yet in construction, but soon. Then there are other projects that are moving toward detailed drawings, which is the step right before construction. Heathcock Hall, which will be an addition to Lewis Hall in chemistry, and then the Center for Connected Learning in Moffett Library. We're adding 2 more floors so that they'll become more like the 2 floors that have already been redone in that library. So lots of construction going on. Then there's kind of facelift construction. I'm sure that people have noticed that Stevens until recently has been covered in sheeting, and we're doing some work on that. So we're trying to do projects and get things started as we have the resources to do them.
Yeah, so let me ask you about the status of another infrastructure project that's stalled. We tried to begin construction in People's Park in August, and we're now operating under an injunction imposed by the appeals court. There have been some hopes that there would be a decision earlier in the fall, in October or November. That hasn't happened, and we're unable to proceed. So do we remain committed to that project? What's your current thinking, and where do things stand as far as you're concerned?
I am deeply committed to that project. We have a desperate need for housing. And just to remind everyone of the components of that project, there will be a residence hall that'll have about 1,000 apartments in it. And then there will be permanent supportive housing for the people of low income and formerly homeless people. That is 125 apartments, I think about 185 beds. And then about almost half the site will be a park. The park will have memorial elements in it that we can co-design with the community to commemorate an important history that happened there. Although I think currently the park isn't very much of an asset to anyone. It's a lot of crime takes place in and around the park, and it just doesn't, to me, offer the kinds of things the campus needs most urgently, and I would say the homeless population needs most urgently, which is housing. Incidentally, we in June, before we tried to begin construction on the site, we offered housing. There were about 60 people at that point camping in the park. We offered housing to them all in a collaborative project we had with the city, in which we've rented the roadway in for 18 months. All but 3 of the people in the park took that offer of housing. And we've been working to move them from the roadway into permanent housing. And I understand that's going fairly well.
Yeah, speaking of which, how are things with the city? I mean, it used to be something, it seemed like you opened up Berkeley side or one of the local papers, and there was constant friction in the town gown relationship, and it doesn't seem to happen anymore. How would you assess our relationship with the city of Berkeley right now?
I think our relationship with the city at this point is very good. I work very collaboratively with the mayor, who, by the way, supports the People's Park project, as does the city council. We work on public safety issues. We work on planning issues. The foundation of our improved relationship with the city is an agreement with the city consequent to our long-range development plan, which involves our contributing a little bit over $4 million a year to the city on a set of projects that we agree upon and that mutually benefit us. And these projects, the ones we're discussing, go all the way from fire prevention in the culling of trees up in what's called the Hill Campus, in other words, up in the hills where the campus owns land, to safety improvements on Berkeley streets, traffic lights, traffic slowing, creation of bike lanes, things like that.
We're going to shift to a broader national topic, and that has to do with diversity and affirmative action. I know just in recent weeks, you've done a couple of interviews with national media outlets that were connected to the Supreme Court, hearing a case that could put an end to affirmative action in universities. And there were questions here for you about, how we've managed or with the efforts we've been making to enhance the diversity of particularly of our student population. What are your current thoughts? How concerned are you on a sort of a national scale about the impact of a Supreme Court decision ending affirmative action? And how are things going on our own campus in terms of enhancing the diversity of all aspects of the campus community?
Well, thanks very much for that question. There's no question in my mind that affirmative action is a really powerful tool in creating diversity in student populations on campus. When the Regents passed first SP1 and SP2, the Regents resolution eliminating attention to race, ethnicity, or gender in admissions, in contracting, and in hiring, our diversity in our student body dropped by a half. And it's been a very long path to some recovery. We're still not at the levels that we were at in the early 90s. However, we've been making a lot of progress recently. We have wonderful leadership in Olufemi Ogundele, who has really come and looked at our admissions process from, in every element of it, trying to figure out whether there are any things in it, procedures that have implicit bias in them. And he's changed a number of things that we do. For example, I'll just use one example. This is before the Regents eliminated the SAT and the ACT as a requirement for application. What he found when he came here is the very first page that a reader saw was the student's SAT or ACT scores. And that obviously creates a kind of framing effect for the whole file. And so he moved that page to the back. That's just one small example. The elimination of the ACT and the SAT as a requirement is another example. And he's changed the way in which readers are assigned areas. We've changed our outreach programs. So we've been making a lot of progress. Each year, we've admitted a more diverse class, but we're still not nearly where we want to be. I worry a lot about what the Supreme Court may rule, because one of the things we can depend on in California is knowing California high schools very well. But if you have a national market, like many of our most competitive privates do, it's much harder to know the high schools. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens if the Supreme Court eliminates that tool in its ruling. But I think Berkeley has a lot to teach in the things that we've discovered help us.
Yeah, interesting, but sort of depressing, I think, in some ways at the same time. I want to go to a question that came in from the audience because it also speaks to the diversity of our community, and it has to do, it's a question about how the campus going forward can and will and is thinking about supporting the LGBTQ plus community. And this is in the wake of, the horrible incident in Colorado, the mass murder in Colorado, rising tide of violence, and also, I think some discussion as a result of a speaker who was on campus who has a very profound anti-LGBTQ plus position. I just want to correct one thing that was, it's a common misconception. It was in the question that the campus hosted this speaker. The campus did not. Hosted by student groups. Student groups are autonomous and independent and have a legally protected ability to invite speakers of their choice, and the campus by law can't interfere with that. But all the same, that speaker's presence had a profound and damaging impact on members of the campus community. And so I guess you're being asked here, what's your own thinking about how we can better support those members of that community within the campus community?
Well, I think it's being very, very public about how we value all sexual and gender identities, and being very creating a good climate on campus. I was actually, though the speakers' views are abhorrent to me, who came to speak on campus, I was also glad that there basically was no incident. He didn't, I mean, of course it was during the strike, but he didn't garner as much response as one might have feared. So I think that was good, but it just making sure that we, in everything we say and do, present our support to the LGBTQ community.
Got it. Thank you. And we've had a couple of other questions come in. I think it looks like it could be from graduate students. And if I can synthesize them, and I'm hoping I'm doing justice to the two questions, they focus, and please, obviously, if we're going to territory you can't speak of because of the prohibition on talking about or opining about the strike. But these are questions about cost of living and about how much it costs to rent, the rent burden on graduate students. And the question is, are there any plans to help alleviate that burden when it comes to graduate students, in particular, the cost of housing, the accessibility of housing? That's obviously an essential part of having a positive experience on campus.
Yeah, I think every member of the campus population, undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, staff, has, suffers an impact from the high cost of housing in the Bay Area. What we're trying to do is increase the amount of campus built and managed housing for actually every element of the community, but for graduate students, I already mentioned the project that we're beginning down near Albany Village. We recently brought into our housing stock in about a year ago. It was opened in January of 2022. The intersection, which is again a project for graduate students in Emeryville, that was a gift to the campus, and all of the money again that we saved through there not being any debt, long-term debt on that building, goes to financial aid for graduate students.
Got it. Let's go from one complicated subject to another. And that is the issue of the Pac-12 athletic conference. I know here too, there's some limitations on what you can say, given that the regions still haven't decided. But for those who haven't been following it, and I know it's taken up a lot of time and your attention, but for those who haven't been following it, what's a synopsis of what the issue is, and what are the current thoughts you can share with us? And I think the regions are planning to decide on the 14th, just around the corner, right?
That's right, just around the corner next week. So USC and UCLA decided, this was at the end of June, to leave the Pac-12 conference and join the Big Ten conference. One of the major sources of financing for athletic departments in Division I schools are media rights, and the Big Ten was just signing a very lucrative media deal that would enable the members to get about $62 million a year in this media deal.
Wow.
So currently the Pac-12 gets around 30. And their media contracts are currently up for negotiation. They're all expiring in 2024. So the departure of USC and UCLA diminishes the value of those media rights, because LA is obviously a major media market, and there won't be, LA teams in the Pac-12 anymore, because they'll be in the Big Ten unless the regions decide to do something about it. So that is a financial hit to Cal, not at the current moment, but anticipated in the worth of the media contracts that it's currently negotiating. The kind of concern that many people have, including me, is that the Big Ten, I think the farthest west school is University of Nebraska, and it extends all the way to Rutgers University in New Jersey. So obviously these are huge travel distances for our student athletes, or for student athletes, for UCLA and USC, that would involve their missing more class time. I could just state my views. I think that I step back for a minute. There are a huge number of changes right now in intercollegiate athletics. There is the right that many state legislators have given athletes to make money from their name, image, and likeness. There are several lawsuits that are what is at stake is whether athletes should be considered employees rather than students. And then there's all of this conference realignment that's been happening. And all of these have budgetary consequences for athletic departments and their sources of revenue. I believe that it's better to have more strong conferences than fewer strong conferences. Some people see a huge consolidation coming in Division I athletics that would result in, just a few mega conferences like the SEC and the Big Ten. I believe we're better off with more strong conferences that involve less travel for student athletes.
Carol, do you have some overarching concerns about where intercollegiate athletics is heading? I mean, is this bound up in some broader concerns that you have?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I really believe in the amateur tradition in intercollegiate athletics, and what we're moving toward is a professionalization, not of all intercollegiate athletics, but of the revenue producing Division I intercollegiate athletics, namely football and men's basketball, with media rights kind of piping the tune for all the other sports. And I think this has a bad impact on Olympic sports, on women's sports. So yes, I very much regret the direction in which things are moving.
Thanks. I want to move in and talk a little bit about rankings, another sort of a hot button issue. But if you don't mind, I'm going to answer another question came in following up about the speaker who was on campus last week, and we were asked if the security provided by the campus was paid for by the student group or the university. And just to say it was paid for the university, that too is a legal obligation of ours. That too is not discretionary. All of that is laid out in our major events policy. We would do the same thing for any student group, regardless of the perspectives of the speaker they invited. And again, it's not a discretionary decision. It's something we have to do as a matter of law.
Right.
Let's talk about rankings. It was interesting. I saw that Dean Chemerinsky has pulled the law school out of the rankings. That created a whole flurry. People have national news. Sky was falling for some. The deliverance had arrived for others. Is this the beginning of the end of rankings?
Oh, who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. I have to say that I'm highly critical of the U.S. News and World Report rankings for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's just a fiction that you can create a 1 to 100 ordinal rank list of institutions as if they were sports teams with win-loss records. You just can't do it. It's a completely false intellectual exercise. What, of course, the various ranking organizations do is they create an algorithm giving so much weight to X, so much weight to Y, so much weight to Z. And what they do is they change that algorithm year to year. They always say it's to make the algorithm better. I actually think the motivation is to create artificial volatility in the rankings, because anybody who's led a college or university knows they're not that easy to change. And the idea that a university goes from number 1 to number 8 in 1 year is ridiculous. What it is created by is changes in the algorithm. And the algorithm weights wealth factors and selectivity factors. And those are not Berkeley's values. I mean, we're a state institution. We operate on in a considerable tighter budgetary environment than our private competitors do. And we pride ourselves on our access, but that's not what the rankings weight. So, and I think the rankings have a destructive effect on students' choices. I've heard some students say, oh, my parents will only let me go to a university that's in the top 10, US News and World Report top 10. And that's silly. There are many good choices for every prospective student. And where a school ranks in US News has very little to do with what kind of choice that institution is for a particular student.
And did you approve of Dean Chemerinsky's decision to?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know our executive vice chancellor and provost, Ben Hermelin, was asked, there was a reporter who was interested. And, Ben just noted that we hadn't really yet had that community-wide conversation about the rankings, and we weren't close to any sort of decision. But is that something that you see in the offing anytime soon, an institutional conversation about where we stand with the rankings, whether we want to continue to participate?
Well, it's a very complicated subject. There are some institutions that have tried to become independent of the rankings. And what US News does is just makes up the data then and it continues to rank them. So I think one of the powers of the law school action is that it was a lot of law schools who did it. So I think this would have to be not an action that a single university takes, but a more general, action.
Got it. Going to change subjects once again. Another complicated one. That's Cal versus Berkeley. I know folks in our office are in the middle of doing market research and leading campus conversations on campus and with stakeholders about the differentiation and when to use which, what's going on. Because the last time we brought this up, which was about 15 years ago, a lot of people sort of freaked out at the idea that we might be getting rid of Cal or we may be doing this or that. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is that we have currently a very strict set of guidelines about who can use Cal and who can use Berkeley. So I'll give you a funny example. There's a wonderful woman, retired staff member from the School of Public Health, who wrote a terrific book about the peregrine falcons on the top of the Campanile, and she wanted to call her book The Cal Falcons. Nope, she couldn't call it that. There was the effort some years ago to study Cal and Berkeley, tried to do something that I think any linguist would tell you was an impossible project, which is to say, you use Cal in these circumstances and you use Berkeley in those circumstances, and you really can't do it. And language is a living thing. And I think most of us code switch very easily between Cal and Berkeley, and we know what circumstances we use Berkeley in, we know what circumstances we use Cal in. There is confusion out there in the wider world. I've certainly had a number of conversations with people, mostly not in California, about people who don't understand that Cal and Berkeley are the same institution. And there's some very interesting research that I saw connected to this branding study, shows that in audiences that are more distant from California, Berkeley is seen as extremely prestigious, but Cal is seen as not prestigious. So it's just, I find it fascinating as someone who studies words. The purpose of this is not to decide on Cal or decide on Berkeley, but rather to have a more reasonable and linguistically realistic idea of how you have these two identities interact and coalesce in a way that isn't quite as confusing, or has a policy that, frankly, it just doesn't serve us very well.
Wow. When do you think there'll be a decision, or when a change?
I think it'll be sometime in the spring, but it won't be a decision, I don't think.
Just
I
sort of
think I think it'll be a loosening of the currently rather rigid guidelines.
Understood. Application numbers, do we have them?
I don't yet. So I don't yet. So I don't know where we are.
Yeah, we're last year we were over 100,000 again.
128,000 for the freshman class alone. And then I think there were about 20,000 for transfer admission.
Yeah, it's sort of remarkable that Berkeley remains the magnet that it is, right? And I'm just wondering, what is that because we've evolved with times, or because we've remained a steady source of kind of academic excellence? What's your sense about that's an incredible number of applications?
Well, I have a rather complicated sense of this. First of all, the state of California is number 49 out of the 50 states in the proportion of places in four-year undergraduate institutions in relationship to the size of its population. So it means that, in part, this is because of the community college system, but California has underinvested in four-year institutions. And you can see it's not just Berkeley that's seeing these application numbers. It's almost all of the UCs that have mid undergraduates are seeing these very big application numbers. I think in part, it's the prestige of these campuses. It's I think, unique in the United States that you have, in fact, it is unique in the United States that of the 9 undergraduate campuses of the University of California, 7 of them are in the American Association of Universities. That's just extraordinary. So they're very high prestige campuses that offer excellent education, that are accessible, and that are, when you compare it to private institutions, relatively efficient economically. So that explains, I think, the large application numbers, quality of institution, but also the fact that it probably strikes many California families as a more affordable alternative. In addition, students are applying to so many more schools. You know, you talk to students, they apply to like 20 schools. When I was applying to college back many decades ago, you applied to 3 schools. That's not the case anymore. So of course that swells everybody's application numbers.
I'm going to go back to before we close to, and it's interesting, and it's, I think, a commentary on not just the university, but California as a whole, and it has to do with cost of housing. We've had a few more questions coming in asking whether the university has a plan or can even do anything about the cost. And somebody brought up an example of, you know, at intersection, it's $1,425 a month. And I'm just reading the question here. You can almost feel the challenge this person is facing. And is there anything we can do? Is there any discussion about that? What's your thinking?
We really can't have an impact on the housing market as such. I think the thing that we can do is to build more housing, which I'm trying to do.
Right. So just a matter of supply and, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And it's, I mean, it seems like everything that the San Francisco Chronicle is filled every single day with more and more stories about the cost of housing throughout the Bay Area, not just the university. So with that, closing thoughts as we're all about to head off and have a little break, and looking forward to the spring semester. Well, as you're thinking ahead,
I want to thank all of the staff who are listening in today for your extraordinary work through this semester. Thank the faculty for your work. Thank the students, if there are any students listening in, and to take the time over the break to relax, to recharge, to be with family and friends, and to have a wonderful holiday season. And thank you for everything that you do for Cal.
And on behalf of the campus community,
and Berkeley.
And Berkeley. And on behalf of the campus community, Chancellor Chris, I want to thank you for all that you do and for your time today. And thank everybody for joining us. We'll see you on the next edition of Campus Conversations.
Bye-bye.
Bye.